In 1834, in the tobacco thick air of rural Virginia, a farmhand named Elias McTavish broke through a cellar door that hadn't been opened in 42 years. What he found in the Sullivan basement would unravel an entire county, silence 3 judges, and leave 47 names carved into stone children, shackled and forgotten beneath a house that should have burned long before the truth surfaced. The Sullivans of Greystone Hollow were not a prominent family by wealth or name, but they commanded a kind of whispered reverence in Culver County. Situated at the edge of a dwindling forest near the foot of the Allegheny foothills, their estate, known as Greystone House, was built in 1792 with stone blackened by time and superstition. It had no known architect. Locals said the structure rose overnight, brought up by masons who worked only in silence, men who vanished the day the mortar dried. To outsiders, the Sullivans were pious, soft-spoken Presbyterians with 6 pale children and a patriarch, Malcolm Sullivan, who wore mourning black even in spring. His wife, Marion, was rarely seen. Some claimed she never once stepped off the porch in 20 years. The family was known for taking in orphans, most of them left at their gate by unmarked wagons. It was a kindness that earned them the nickname the White Cross family, a reference to the crude wooden symbol nailed above their door. But inside Greystone House, silence ruled. No schoolteacher ever saw the orphans after intake. No physician visited. No child who entered the estate ever enrolled in the county census. And the neighbors, trained by time and fear, simply stopped asking. In March of 1834, after the Sullivans were declared missing, all of them, without a trace, county officials reluctantly sent a farmhand to break through the floorboards that creaked and shifted as if something beneath them had begun to breathe. What Elias McTavish saw made him fall to his knees. In a basement sealed with iron hooks and salt-packed seams, he found 47 skeletal children chained to the stone wrists, bound to rotting wooden beams, heads tilted upward as if they had been waiting for a voice that never came. The air was thick with the scent of iron, damp stone, and something fouler, a residue of prayers unanswered and secrets buried too deep to rot cleanly. And on the wall, in the hand of a child, they fed us verses, not bread. By the time dawn touched the high steeple of the Culver Presbyterian Church on April 2nd, 1834, the name Sullivan had been scrubbed from the town's tongue like a blasphemy. No townsman admitted to having seen them leave, yet their house stood hollow, food half-cooked, a chair toppled, one of the family's many Bibles lying open and soaked in lamp oil. There were no signs of violence, no blood, no struggle. Just absence. The livestock in the barn starved where they stood. Letters remained unsent on the writing desk, stamped and addressed in the patriarch's clean hand. Malcolm Sullivan's boots were found by the hearth, still warm from the last coal fire. But the family, gone, the orphans, gone. Only the silence remained. For 6 days, the local constable delayed any formal search. He claimed legal ambiguity, no crime, no cause. But those who remembered whispered of a deeper cause, fear. The Sullivans had been bound to something older than law. Some said Marion was gifted, that her hymns could still the wind or call crows to roost. Others remembered Malcolm's eyes, dead, gray irises like pewter coins sunk in water. Not mad, but too still, too practiced. When McTavish discovered the cellar, everything shifted. The deputy who arrived to document the scene turned white and walked into the river that same night, never to resurface. The second constable, a Civil War veteran with scars down his back, retched so violently on entry to the basement he ruptured his throat and bled out in the yard. None of the children found bore proper names. No records, no baptismal logs, only chalk markings above each set of chains numbers, carved into the stone in descending order: 47, 46, 45. One, scratched into the far wall, had been obliterated, struck repeatedly with a sharp implement until the stone itself fractured. No remains were found at that position, just an empty chain, freshly snapped. Inside the basement, drawings covered the walls, childish at first glance, but too symmetrical, circles within circles, eyes without pupils, a door, always a door, but no handle, below each sketch, the same words scrawled in charcoal. When he opens it, we disappear. Officials tried to board the house, to torch it, but the fire would not catch. Rain fell only on that property for 7 days, though no storm crossed the valley. The Sullivans were never found. But Greystone House had only just begun to whisper. Culver County, 1835. Just 1 year after the Sullivan disappearance, maps were redrawn. Greystone Hollow was erased, not renamed, not absorbed, erased. The records clerk in Richmond, upon being asked about its removal, claimed the valley never existed. When shown signed land deeds, he laughed and said, "Then your ghosts own property." Something in the town had shifted. The people, those who stayed, aged differently, not in body but in voice, in memory, in posture. School teachers began to forget their students' names. Mothers left lanterns burning through the day and didn't know why. The pastor at Culver Presbyterian began his sermons with the wrong scripture and ended them with his eyes fixed on the floor, trembling. There were no more children in Culver County by 1840, not one. Births ceased, adoptions ended, orphanages locked their doors and dissolved in silence. It was as though the land had made a pact, or perhaps it had been broken. The judge, assigned to review the Sullivan estate, Abraham Quince, vanished en route to the courthouse, his carriage found tipped into a dry creek bed. The wheels weren't broken, nor the horses disturbed. But the carriage was lined inside with hundreds of small black feathers from no known bird in the region. On the wooden paneling, written in pitch or blood, was the phrase, "We were never meant to leave." A federal inquiry in 1842 was quietly formed and more quietly disbanded. Of the 5 officials who traveled to Culver, 3 resigned, 1 committed suicide, and the 5th returned home raving about the hollow house that breathes under the roots. By 1845, Culver County no longer appeared in state directories. Locals still lived there, but their mail no longer arrived. Trains would not stop. Maps from outside drew forests where roads once led. The house remained. Covered in ash-gray moss, its shutters nailed, yet no matter how many planks were placed over its doors, they would be found pried away the next morning. The boards never broke, they were lifted, cleanly, precisely. As if the house itself wanted to be opened, piece by piece. Children who passed near the property claimed to hear knocking beneath their feet. Even when standing on stone, one girl went deaf after whispering a prayer through the basement window. She never spoke again, but drew pictures obsessively, dozens of pages, all of the same thing, a spiral staircase curling endlessly downward, into something too dark to name. In 1851, nearly 2 decades after the basement discovery, a rotting trunk was unearthed during the collapse of the Culver County poorhouse roof. Inside were 3 damaged journals bound in stitched hide, one of them marked with a white cross identical to the one that once adorned the Sullivan household. The ledger was assumed to be Marion Sullivan's, though the handwriting shifted wildly between pages, delicate on some, jagged, and almost carved on others. The first few entries were mundane, grocery lists, hymns, and psalms. But by the 4th page, something fractured. She stopped writing in full sentences. Her words bled together, and then came the list: 103 names, all children, none matching any known school or church roster. Next to each name, a single word annotation: accepted, refused, withdrew, offered, and beside some, a simple black X. At the bottom of the page in trembling script, we keep only the ones he hears. The third journal, more disturbing than the rest, was written entirely in phonetic Lat, in much of it corrupted beyond comprehension, but one phrase was repeated across margins, page headers, even between the lines of Marian's fading script, Porta clavata est, the door is locked. A scholar from the College of William and Mary attempted a full translation in 1853. He abandoned the project after 3 weeks and was institutionalized the same year for attempting to nail shut all the doors in his home, even cupboards and wardrobes. Before his removal, he reportedly muttered to his wife for days, "You can't open what was never made to close." These journals referenced something called the stone below, described in vague but reverent terms, not a structure, but a place. Or rather, a presence that exists only once it is acknowledged. It was always beneath, always patient, and the children those taken in by the Sullivans were described not as orphans, but as listeners, chosen not for who they were, but for what they could hear when the adults could not. An entire section was torn from the middle of the final journal. Its binding looked burnt, but there was no charring on the paper around it, as if the missing pages had vanished cleanly, unnaturally. On the final remaining page, written not in ink, but in what looked like powdered bone, one got out, and that was dated July 16th, 1833, 8 months before the Sullivan family vanished. In October of 1854, a young boy was discovered wandering the woods just 6 miles outside the forgotten boundary of Greystone Hollow. He was naked, silent, and covered in soot. The doctor who took him in noted a strange absence of wounds or scars, despite the cold and rough terrain. The boy would not speak, but he would hum a slow, droning melody that resembled no known hymn, but evoked an almost sickening familiarity, as though it was something ancient and buried. He had no name. No fingerprints matched, no local family claimed him. He was estimated to be about 10 years old, though his eyes carried the vacancy of something far older. A local woman, a widow named Sarah Kelter, agreed to shelter him temporarily at the county's dwindling poorhouse. She came to call him Isaiah, because the only word he ever wrote carved into the floor beneath his bed imperfect, even lettering, was Isaiah 34:14. That verse reads, "The wild beasts of the desert shall also meet with the wild beasts of the island, and the satyr shall cry to his fellow. The screech owl also shall rest there, and find for herself a place of rest." Isaiah would sit at the edge of the bed each night and stare into a hand mirror. But here's where the records become unsteady. 4 separate caregivers reported that the mirror reflected the room, the bed, the window, but not the boy. No matter the angle, no matter the light, he cast no image. Photographs taken of the poorhouse that winter show Isaiah standing in frame, but when the plates were developed, his figure appeared only as a black absence, not a blur, not a shadow, but a hollow space. As if something had been cut out of the film. On the 7th week, Sarah Kelter reported waking in the middle of the night to find Isaiah standing at the basement door, barefoot and whispering to the wood. When she asked what he was saying, he simply turned and said, "They're louder now." The next morning, Isaiah was gone. The mirror in his room shattered inward, carved into the stone wall in that same perfect lettering. "I remember the door. I remember the stairs. I remember his breath." Isaiah was never found, but for 3 consecutive nights, every child in the surrounding counties from Henrico to Cumberland woke screaming the same phrase, "Don't open it. Please don't open it." In the winter of 1856, as snowfall buried much of central Virginia, the bell tower of the long, abandoned Culver Presbyterian Church tolled at midnight for 7 consecutive nights. There was no congregation, no clergy, and the tower's rope had been cut since the dissolution of the church in 1840, yet the sound echoed deep, low, and mournful across the silent county. Locals from nearby towns reported hearing the bells as far as 20 miles away. Some said it sounded like metal, others insisted it was bone. That same week, a traveling surveyor named Cornelius Vaught sought shelter in the church ruins. What he found inside would only be known decades later through his private journal, mailed posthumously to his brother in Massachusetts after Vaught died of pneumonia the following year. The journal's pages were weathered, much of it illegible, but one entry was scrawled in ink so heavy it bled through 3 pages. "The tower is hollow. The bell was never meant to ring. It is not a warning, it is accounting." Behind the altar, beneath a loose flagstone, Vaught uncovered a rusted metal box containing brittle parchment wrapped in faded red cloth. This was the bell ringer's ledger, a near indecipherable record kept by the church's last known caretaker, Deacon Howell Stray. The entries are dated between 1825 and 1833, just before the Sullivan disappearance, and they detail midnight rites and silent baptisms, performed not upon the congregation, but upon those marked by the listening. He referred to them as the hollow children. Many pages were missing or soaked in what appeared to be melted wax, but one line was repeated dozens of times along the margins. 40, 8 must gather. 40, 7 have been chained. 1 remains unsealed. Stray's writing deteriorates near the end, letters trembling, syntax broken. The final entry is barely readable, but it includes one name, repeated 7 times in bleeding ink. Marion, 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 Marion. There is no death record for Deacon Stray. But 2 decades later, his wedding ring was discovered embedded in the inner wall of the Greystone basement, lodged deep in the stone itself, surrounded by thin, child-sized scratch marks, as if the wall had swallowed him, as if something within had claimed its servant and left behind only the brass ring of his vow. In the early spring of 1858, a series of strange complaints began emerging from loggers working the woods bordering the old Greystone estate. Several crews refused to continue operations, claiming the trees groaned, not from the wind but from beneath. One man described it as a choir with no mouths. The foreman, a grizzled veteran of backwoods industry named Thomas Yates, dismissed the stories until a red oak collapsed on its own one evening. No wind, no axe, no rot. Its trunk was hollow, but not from decay. Inside, the wood had been scraped away, carefully, deliberately. Tiny scratch marks spiraled upward, perfectly measured, as if from small hands. At the center of the hollow was a single human tooth. That night, Yates followed a faint humming into the woods. He later described it as the kind of song you hum only when you've forgotten all the words but still remember the grief. He reached a clearing near the remnants of the Sullivan property, a place where the soil never thawed, not even in June. There, he found a ring of stones blackened by age, and in the center, a hole, perfectly round, no signs of erosion, no animal burrows, just a dark, endless shaft lined with what appeared to be fingernail fragments. Yates dropped a lantern in. It did not hit bottom. He returned to town and tried to file a report, but the sheriff refused to write it down, said there was no Greystone Hollow, and never had been. When Yates insisted, the sheriff told him plainly, "The last man who went down there brought something back that spoke without a tongue. That house isn't empty, it's just full of things we've forgotten how to see." Yates left the logging company the next week and moved west. He never spoke of it again, but in 1901, when his great-grandson sold the family home, a box of sketches was found in the attic, each drawing the same image: a tree with no leaves, its roots not in the ground, but hanging downward like a man hanged upside down. At the bottom of every sketch, the same phrase in a child's hand: "The sound is in the soil. Don't listen too long." By 1861, rumors of the Greystone estate and the Sullivan basement had almost vanished, buried under the noise of the looming Civil War. But on the eve of Virginia's secession, a Union cartographer named Lewis Bell arrived in Culver's former region. His assignment: update military topography and confirm rumors of an unmarked valley once home to peculiar terrain and religious settlements. Bell's notes, recovered years later in a Richmond archive mislabeled as private correspondence, describe an encounter with what he termed a structure without geometry. He had located the Greystone property, or rather, what was left of it. The house was collapsed inwards, not from rot or fire, but as if it had been pulled from within by an unseen gravity. Every beam, every stone angled not outward in decay, but inward as if sucked toward a single point below. In what remained of the foundation, Bell found a stairwell cracked, but intact, leading down. He descended 19 steps, then 27, then 43. He lost count. He wrote of the air growing colder, not in a natural way, but hollow. The kind of cold that doesn't cling to the skin, but enters the thoughts. At the bottom was no room, no corridor, just a wall, smooth, black, and humming, not visibly vibrating, but humming inside the bones. And set into that impossible stone, a door, or at least the idea of a door. There were no hinges, no seams, just an outline tall, narrow, and wrong. Bell said it was the shape of something that had once been a door, before language invented the concept. Scratched into the stone nearby, in dozens of handwritings, some tiny, some adult, some backwards, were messages: "Don't knock. His eye is open even in sleep. The 48th was not ready. You are not alone in this silence." Bell tried to sketch the shape, but his lines always blurred. Ink bled on the page, no matter what pen or paper he used. He returned to camp, silent, and never submitted his map. His colleagues noted he tore the seams of every tent he entered, cutting open corners and flaps. When asked why, he answered, "I won't be inside something that doesn't have a way out." He disappeared 6 days later, his compass found pointing not north but downward. In 1864, as war ravaged Virginia's soil, a Confederate medic named Elias Hart was stationed near a skirmish line close to the remnants of what once was Culver County. Hart was a man of science, cold, precise, disillusioned by faith and war alike. But in a letter recovered by his granddaughter in 1927, he described a patient unlike any other. The soldier was no older than 16, pale and trembling, brought in after being found walking alone in a tattered Union coat. No visible wounds, no dog tags, no weapons. He carried only a pocket Bible inside, a single-page dog-geared, Isaiah 34. The boy never gave a name, but Elias found something else, tattooed crudely into the boy's shoulder blade, as if with ash and wire, were the Roman numerals, Roman 48. 48, Hart assumed it was a regiment marking, until he removed the boy's shirt. Carved into his back in countless small, overlapping lines, hundreds, possibly thousands of repetitions, was the phrase, "He watches from the deep stair." The boy refused food, slept only standing, and whispered incessantly into the corner of his cot. He called it the seam in the sky. The nurses believed he was hallucinating war trauma, starvation, until during one midnight watch, 4 separate orderlies heard a sound rise from beneath the floorboards of the field tent. Not footsteps, not movement, a slow, deliberate breathing. The boy began to scream. He screamed until his throat tore. His final act before slipping into unconsciousness was to claw open the skin at his chest, trying to dig something out that wasn't there. His hands left bloodied letters on the tent wall. "I wasn't the last. I wasn't the last." He died the next morning. His body was buried in an unmarked grave, but the Bible remained. Inside it, tucked in the binding, Hart found a yellowed scrap of parchment, a ledger page, a familiar one, 47 names, all crossed out. A final name below them, written in different ink, darker than the others. M. Sullivan, not Marion, Malcolm. The father had been the final offering, but then, beneath that name, one more, faint as if added long after the page had aged, one returned. In 1872, a series of strange events struck a remote seminary for orphan boys outside Lynchburg, Virginia. Officially named St. Belladonna's Refuge, the institution was known for its rigid theology and harsh discipline. But over the course of a single winter, 3 boys vanished without explanation, all from locked rooms. No signs of forced entry, no footprints in the snow, no broken locks. Only one thing was consistent. Each bed was found drenched in water. The seminary's headmaster, Father Orville Cray, began keeping a private record. In his journal later recovered from the hollow of a chapel wall, he described the arrival of a strange, silent boy in November. The boy had no papers, no known origin, and was left at the gate wrapped in black cloth. His admission records are still missing. The staff called him Ewan. Father Cray claimed Ewan spoke only once, the night of his arrival. As Cray blessed him with holy water, the boy looked up and asked, "How deep is the father's house?" That night, the chapel bells rang at 2:11 a.m., a time they had never been programmed to chime. The caretaker, Brother Lang, was found the next morning at the base of the bell tower, both legs shattered. He claimed he had been pulled up the tower, not fallen from it. The bell rope was cleanly severed. Ewan never ate, never blinked. He did not respond to questions or reprimands, but when alone, he would draw, always the same image, a figure standing before a black door. The figure had no face, only a mouth. Open wide, behind the door was a staircase, and beneath the drawing, in faint graphite, he called me again. I tried not to hear. Father Cray attempted to baptize Ewan a second time, pouring holy water over his head in a desperate effort to seal the spirit. But the water hissed as it touched the boy's skin, like oil on flame. Cray collapsed moments later, suffering what he described in his final journal entry as a noise so loud it split silence itself. Ewan vanished that same night. His bed, like the others before him, soaked. The stone tiles beneath it were warped, bowed downward as if the floor had begun to sag into something unseen. The next morning, every clock in the seminary stopped at 3:33 a.m., and carved into the chapel's wooden crucifix, where Christ's feet once were, was a new symbol, a door, with no handle, and a single eye above it. By 1883, the events of Greystone Hollow had all but faded from public memory. But in a dusty archive beneath the University of Virginia, a researcher named Professor Julian Heath stumbled across a mislabeled box of ledgers. He wasn't looking for the Sullivans, he was cataloging birth records. But one brittle volume, spine-rotted and marked only with a white X, contained names he'd never seen in any registry. 47 names, all children, no surnames, each with a date but not of birth or death. The dates were staggered across nearly a decade, from 1824 to 1833. Heath's curiosity turned to obsession when he found his own great aunt's name among them, a girl long rumored to have vanished in infancy, though family legend claimed she had died of illness. But there she was, listed plainly with the word sealed beside her entry. What disturbed Heath most wasn't the name, it was the smell that came with the book. Damp earth, iron, and something else. Something ancient and foul, like mold grown in the lungs. He traced the ledger to an estate record once housed at a now defunct church in Culver County. No one he spoke with remembered such a church existing. No maps listed it, but a retired surveyor's journal from 1838, locked in the university's restricted archives, referenced it plainly. Culver Presbyterian, constructed upon the oldest stone, that which hums below. Heath went silent for 2 weeks after that. When he returned to his classes, his lectures had changed. Once a man of science, he began speaking of resonant structures, audible thresholds, and sacred architecture built not to honor God, but to bind something older. His students reported hearing rhythmic tapping under the lecture hall floor, always in sevens. One student, a skeptic, stomped back. The tapping paused, then resumed, faster, harder, louder. Campus officials found Heath days later inside the bell tower, emaciated and smiling. He had boarded himself in with broken pews, removed all clocks and watches from the room, and painted the walls black with melted shoe polish. His final words before being committed: "I heard it, not a voice, a shape. It wants to finish the count." Inside his locked briefcase was a single scrap of parchment, folded many times over. On it, in tiny, precise script, was written, "There were never 47. There were 49. 2 remain." In the summer of 1891, a mason named Franklin Orser was contracted to renovate the crumbling foundation of a colonial-era home in Amherst, Virginia, a home with no recorded occupants since the 1840s. It was a simple job: replace rotted beams, shore up the cellar walls, clear any debris. But on the third day, his team found something that wasn't in the blueprints: a staircase, narrow, spiraling, cut directly into the stone beneath the house, descending at a perfect angle with no structural purpose. Franklin had overseen dozens of renovations. He knew when something didn't belong. This staircase didn't erode or crumble like the surrounding brickwork. It was smooth, black stone, cold to the touch, too cold for summer. He ordered it sealed immediately, but that night, one of his crew, a young laborer named Denny March, went back. He left no note. No signs of struggle, only a trail of muddy footprints down into the basement, and nothing back up. Franklin didn't call the police. He never finished the job. Instead, he locked the house and left Virginia altogether. But 10 years later, in 1901, he wrote a letter to a colleague that was never sent. It was found after his death in a drawer, beneath a Bible that had been nailed shut. The letter described what he saw when he followed Denny's path just once. He had gone 6 steps down before he realized the stone underfoot no longer echoed his movement. It absorbed it. Each step became quieter, as though the air itself were thickening. The light from his lantern bent inward, shrinking. On the 7th step, he turned back, but the cellar was gone. Behind him was only wall, smooth, black, seamless. Then came the whisper, not from below, from inside his own thoughts: 48 walks, 49 waits, and then we return. He ran. He doesn't remember how. He only remembers waking outside, mud covering his arms, eyes raw from crying. Years later, his children claimed he would mutter at night, always numbers, always the same rhythm, always ending on 47, before breaking into sobs. That staircase, he insisted, had not been there before. The foundation was solid, the blueprints clear, but somehow it had grown there, like a tumor in the architecture of the world. In 1908, a folklorist and amateur audio archivist named Lydia Monroe began recording oral histories from rural families along the edge of the Shenandoah Valley. She was known for capturing dying Appalachian hymns, whispers of old rituals, and half-remembered ghost stories passed down through bloodlines. But in the summer of that year, she recorded something no one could explain and no one could erase. The subject was a 94-year-old woman named Maudine Gresh, living alone in a collapsing shack built near the remnants of a tobacco farm. Monroe found her lucid, deeply religious, and obsessed with time. She kept 17 clocks in her parlor, none of which ticked. She claimed they had to be held still so he doesn't find the gaps. Lydia asked her about a local legend, a house once buried beneath the woods, children who vanished, chains found in stone. Maudine grew pale, refused to answer, but as Lydia packed to leave, the old woman murmured, "He keeps them in the turn. When the music ends, they scream." Monroe, puzzled but intrigued, left her phonograph cylinder recording overnight while she slept in the next room. The next morning, Maudine was dead, no sign of violence, just collapsed in her chair. All 17 clocks stopped at 4:44 a.m., but the phonograph had captured something. On the wax cylinder was 2 minutes and 43 seconds of what initially sounded like wind. But under close inspection by Columbia University's early audio engineers in 1910, a chilling pattern emerged. There were voices, dozens, children, whispering, chanting, weeping, all layered beneath the noise. They repeated phrases that should not have matched. The stairs go down but never stop. He walks where names once lived. Marion said the door must bleed before it opens. The most disturbing moment came at the end, a child's voice, clear and close to the microphone. 48 is awake. Then silence, and one sharp, metallic knock, as if something had struck the inside of the phonograph horn. The cylinder was archived and later removed from the university's collection without explanation. Lydia Monroe suffered a nervous breakdown 3 months later. In her final recorded statement to her sister, she said, "If sound can trap them, what happens when we listen too long? The wax cylinder still exists, kept in a locked vault by a private collector. Its surface is cracked, but some say if you spin it by hand, the knock still comes." In 1916, the St. Belladonna Seminary was shut down for good. Officially, the closure was attributed to financial collapse and moral disrepair. Unofficially, it was because of the eye. The incident began with renovations. The dioceses had planned to repurpose the aging building into a boarding school. Workers arrived in March to begin stripping the floors of the main chapel. On the second day, they uncovered a strange stone, black, oval, and set flush into the ground. At first, it was mistaken for a burial marker, but it had no inscription, only a single deep groove spiraling inward, like a pupil etched into the surface. It felt warm to the touch, even through gloves. A foreman named Carter Wex attempted to pry it loose. His crew described a sudden change in him. His movements slowed, speech slurred. He stood motionless for nearly an hour, hand resting on the eye, lips muttering what sounded like reversed Latin. That night, he walked barefoot into the woods and never returned. The following morning, workers found something worse. The floor had cracked around the eye, not naturally, deliberately, like something beneath had pushed upward. Along the new fissures, dozens of small handprints were found pressed into the dirt, child-sized, pressed too deep. Some were facing the wrong direction, as if the hands had not been reaching up, but pulling down. The site was closed immediately. The diocese sent in a specialist, Father Lowell, a theologian with ties to older Vatican orders. He stayed one night. His final written note, found in his coat pocket outside the seminary gate, read, "It is not a place, it is a consequence." The 48th is not a child, it is what they made to fill the silence. After that, the eye was sealed in concrete. The building was abandoned, but locals say strange things still happen near the ruins. Dogs refuse to pass the chapel lawn, compasses spin. Children report dreams of staircases with no end and knocking that comes from their own bones. One boy, 8 years old, was found sleepwalking there in 1932. He claimed he heard a voice call him. When asked what it said, he replied, "It said the basement is full again," and he pointed not to the chapel, but to the ground beneath his own feet. In 1921, while dismantling an abandoned rectory adjacent to the St. Belladonna Seminary grounds, a crew unearthed a sealed iron strongbox buried beneath the main office. Inside was a single object, a leather-bound ledger, thick with damp pages that seemed untouched by time. The first half of the book was standard: births, baptisms, deaths, records dating back to the early 1800s, but the second half, the handwriting changed, so did the language. At first glance, the script looked like archaic Latin, but further examination revealed that none of the words were real. Scholars who examined the book described it as a kind of anti-language, symbols that mimicked human syntax but dissolved under logic. One line repeated again and again, each name a gate, each gate a mouth. The most disturbing pages listed names, hundreds of them arranged in columns. But no surnames, no dates, no family origins, and none of the names could be traced in any Virginia census, death registry, or baptismal record. Most were deeply strange: Veltha, Coronel, Mirtham, Elshit. Names that felt half-formed, like they were whispered rather than spoken. At the bottom of one page, a phrase was etched in deeper ink: 40, 7 have been returned, the 48th is listening. The Vatican reportedly dispatched a linguist, priest from the Ordo Ex Spiritus, to investigate. His name was Father Inigo Dell. His personal journal, later recovered from his hotel room, described vivid dreams of children with rotted lips reciting verses backwards in unison. He wrote that the ledger smelled of milk and soil, and that touching it made his fingertips go numb. On his fourth night in Belladonna, Father Dell vanished. A chambermaid at the inn claimed she saw him outside at midnight, kneeling in the garden, speaking to the dirt. When authorities dug the spot where he knelt, they found nothing. But the grass had been woven into letters. A single word: Marian. To this day, theologians debate whether the ledger was a hoax, a schizophrenic record, or something darker. But those who have handled it report the same phenomena. Asterisk, they hear knocking. Asterisk, their dreams repeat. Asterisk, and when they close their eyes, they see a spiral. No one knows what the names mean, only that no one was ever born with them, not yet. It had been a whisper until then. For decades, the story was always the same. 47 children, chained and starved, found beneath the Sullivan home in 1834, their bodies misshapen by malnourishment and something far less explainable. The records were sparse. Most names were erased. The Sullivan family fled or vanished. The basement was sealed. But in 1942, during a wartime archival project, a forgotten crate was pulled from the cellar of the Richmond courthouse. Inside were wax-sealed folders, yellowed and brittle. One was labeled only Sullivan subject #48. There had always been rumors, a missing record, a miscount, that the children spoke of another, not a sibling, not a captor, but something they referred to as the one in the hollow. A child who never blinked, who spoke without breathing, who came through the ceiling. Inside the file was a photograph, sepia-toned, slightly blurred, but clear enough. A small figure seated in the far corner of the basement, knees to chest, staring directly into the lens. The child's eyes were wide, and where the irises should be, there was only white. A note was paper, clipped to the image. It read, "Not among the dead, not listed in the orphanage, not traceable through Sullivan bloodline, no reflection in glass, avoid mirrors." The file ended there. But what followed was stranger still. Throughout the 1940s, multiple reports surfaced of people seeing a child matching the photograph, not in Virginia, but across scattered rural towns in Maryland, North Carolina, and Georgia. Always barefoot, always watching from a distance, always gone before authorities arrived. One woman in Asheville claimed the boy knocked on her door during a thunderstorm. He asked to come in before the screaming starts. She refused. That night, her youngest son was found catatonic in his bed, his hands clenched around handfuls of his own hair, his eyes rolled back. He spoke one sentence for the rest of his life. He told me my name isn't mine. Some believe the 48th child wasn't a child at all. Not born, not captured, but summoned, or worse, inherited. A soul created not through birth, but through the combined silence of 47 lost voices, each one calling for someone, or something, to carry on the hunger. In the spring of 1950, a group of state surveyors was sent to map the land around the decaying Sullivan estate before a proposed redevelopment. The town of Belladonna had long since been depopulated, left to rot in the cradle of the Blue Ridge. But as the team passed the broken gates of the estate, they found something chilling. Small bundles of cloth tied to the iron bars, each containing a single human tooth. That same month, across 3 elementary schools in Virginia and West Virginia, teachers reported a peculiar incident. Children, unrelated and from different counties, began to draw identical symbols during their free time. Spirals repeating inwards, always with 47 small dots around the outer edge, and one larger black one at the center. Psychologists were brought in, suspecting a hysteria effect. But when the children were questioned individually, they told similar stories. He shows up in the corners of the ceiling. He doesn't talk with his mouth. He told me my real mom is underground. When asked his name, most children gave different answers, except one that recurred again and again, Silith. The name had no clear origin, not biblical, not mythic, not in any census. Yet, when spoken aloud in the presence of other children, some would become immediately distressed. One 7-year-old girl began to convulse and claw at her ears. She later described a voice in her head shouting backwards, and a girl in the wall pulling her own hair out. Parental fear spread rapidly. Rumors erupted of mass possession, of rural cults, of secret radio frequencies triggering madness. But all cases disappeared after a week. The children returned to normal. The drawings stopped. There were no long-term symptoms. Except for one. Each child, regardless of location, developed a small patch of discolored skin, usually on the back or inner wrist. In ultraviolet light, those patches glowed faintly, forming a mark, a spiral, like the one they had drawn. But this time with only one dot. The leading child psychologist on the case, Dr. Ruth Albridge, took her own life 6 months later. Her suicide note was brief, just 3 lines. The 47th is the gate. The 48th is the key. We were never meant to name them. By 1967, Belladonna, Virginia, had been fully erased from official maps. The roads leading in were left to rot, overtaken by weeds and wild thistle. The courthouse in nearby Staunton quietly removed all reference to the Sullivan property. It had become something of a whispered joke in surrounding towns. Don't follow the crow's flight, they'd say, unless you want to see where the earth still breathes. But in October of that year, a team of amateur urban explorers, 3 college students from Roanoke, found something buried beneath the old survey maps. An unlabeled section of subterranean tunnels, hand-dug, extending outward like a spider's legs beneath the Sullivan homestead. These weren't sewage lines or storm drains. They were narrow, uneven, clawed into the clay like something tried to crawl up and couldn't. The students, documenting their expedition with an 8mm film camera, entered one of the tunnels. The footage was recovered 3 months later, water, damaged and decayed but viewable. What it captured has become the center of endless speculation among historians, occult researchers, and folklorists. About 400 feet into the tunnel, they discovered a chamber circular, domed, its walls covered in soot, blackened handprints. In the center stood a wooden chair, child-sized, built from coffin wood and fastened with braided hair. Around it, 47 crude etchings of children's faces, each scratched deep into the stone with fingernails or teeth. Then came the audio, at first just silence, then faint whispers layered indistinct, like dozens of voices speaking at once underwater. But one phrase cut through in perfect clarity, spoken in a child's voice. He never left. Seconds later, the camera dropped. The last frame, captured before the reel jammed, showed a small, pale foot descending from the ceiling upside down. 2 of the students were found wandering 10 miles east, dehydrated, their shoes filled with blood, unable to speak. The third, a girl named Eloise Murray, was never found. But on the back of the final film strip, written in what appeared to be her handwriting, were the words, "We reached the center of the spiral." After that incident, the area was sealed again, but this time not by the state. Locals reported unmarked trucks arriving at the property, men in long coats. the sound of something heavy being lowered into the tunnels, and then silence, as if something had been reburied, or worse, fed. By the winter of 1971, a new pattern emerged, one that linked the Sullivan tragedy to a much broader, older network of disappearances. Over a span of nearly 80 years, records were found of 47 orphanages across the eastern United States, many since demolished or quietly defunded, each with an unexplained loss of children on its books. In most cases, no investigations were made. The children were simply marked as relocated, unclaimed, or in the most cryptic reports, returned to source. A name surfaced again and again in these files, though always misspelled or slightly altered. Silas Sullivan, S. Solomon, S. Lemon, or just S. But in every photograph, every signature, every note in the margins, one detail remained unchanged: the handwriting, looped, precise, obsessively symmetrical. The man from the orphanage. He had no birth record, no death certificate, but he was listed as a visiting inspector, a placement official, or special clergy liaison in orphanages stretching from Albany to New Orleans. His visits coincided with the periods when children went missing, sometimes just 2, other times 5, but always less than 10, never enough to draw serious attention, never enough to open federal files. But in 1971, a woman named Mary Colville, a former matron at a Catholic-run children's home in Lexington, Kentucky, broke silence. She had kept a file, photographs, journals, even a lock of graying hair, which she claimed belonged to Mr. S. She remembered the sound of his voice, how it didn't quite match his mouth. It was like hearing someone speak from the bottom of a well. But what disturbed her most wasn't the disappearances. It was the ritual. He asked for one child to be woken at midnight, always a quiet one, always an orphan with no known parents. He would take the child to the chapel, and when they returned an hour later, they would not speak, not ever again. Their eyes would look older, too old. Mary described one such child, a boy named Henry Lask, who drew spirals endlessly in the weeks that followed. He eventually gouged one into the wooden floor of the orphanage dormitory with a spoon. It measured precisely 47 inches across. Henry died by suicide at 15. His final note read, "He lives in the spaces between the walls," and beneath that, in smaller writing, so faint it nearly disappeared, "I was never really born." Today, nothing remains of the Sullivan estate, at least not above ground. The house was burned down in 1981 after a series of fires no fire marshal could explain. The ground itself seemed to sweat with smoke for days afterward, and nearby wells ran black for weeks. The land was declared uninhabitable by the Virginia Department of Health, not due to contamination, but due to something they called persistent atmospheric disturbance. No further explanation was given. But in 1993, a satellite image taken by a forestry surveillance drone revealed something deeply unsettling. Beneath the overgrowth of trees and thickets of brush, a perfect outline of the original Sullivan home had reappeared, not in structure but in shadow. The pattern of the weeds, the dead grass, and even the animal migration paths seemed to respect the original blueprint of the house. No plants grew in the basement's shape. No birds nested above it, as if the land still remembered. More disturbing still were the sounds: campers nearby, illegally trespassing during a summer solstice, reported hearing faint voices beneath the soil. Not screams, lullabies, in a language none could identify. One camper claimed to have recorded the audio, but upon returning home, found every device in his bag wiped clean, with only one file remaining: a low hum, precisely 47 seconds long, embedded with a sub-frequency that caused nausea in anyone who heard it. In 2006, a private group of paranormal researchers attempted one last descent into what was left of the Sullivan tunnels. They brought state-of-the-art equipment, drones, ground-penetrating radar, motion detectors. All footage they collected was lost in a fire, again unexplained. But one member, a woman named Elise Marin, kept a handwritten journal. Her final entry is chilling. "It is not a house, it is not a tunnel, it is not even a place. It is an idea that grew teeth. It fed on the forgotten. It made flesh from loneliness. It built itself out of absence." She ends with a final warning: you cannot exhume what was never buried, you cannot silence what was never born, and you cannot save children who never had names. To this day, the town of Belladonna is listed as dissolved. No official road leads there. No GPS pin will find it, but those who know, who truly know, say if you follow the crow's flight at dusk and stand still long enough, you'll hear it breathing. The basement isn't gone, it's waiting.